Okay, here we are in Blender, and I'm going to be using the new Blender 2.91. If you're using Blender 2.8 or above, it should be very easy to follow along. All of the features, for the most part, exist within earlier versions of Blender, but the interface looks a lot different, so you'll kind of have to work through the interface differences if you're using an older version of the software. Just a quick note about the version number, it's always written down here in the bottom right, so if you're ever unsure about what version I'm using, um, let's say your version of Blender has a button in a different place, you could just check that down here to see what I'm currently using. So what I want to talk about right now is folder organization. Because we're going to be creating so many files and folders, we have to be really good about our naming conventions and about where we are keeping everything in our project folder. So just to quickly give you a tour of my project folder. So I have a folder here I called animatic, and inside I have a folder for my After Effects. So that's where I'm going to be doing my audio editing and editing clips of different shots together. We have a folder called animatic renders. And it looks like this one is actually an auto-created folder, so we're going to drop that in there. So we have animatic renders, and inside of animatic renders, this is created from Blender's viewport render, which I'll show in a bit. But essentially each camera is named here at the beginning. So I have cam 1, cam 2, and cam 3, and I have different versions. Sometimes I like to have different parts of the timeline in different image sequences, depending on what I'm trying to accomplish, or I'll come up with a new sequence of animation that I want to render, and I can do this after the fact by having some additional animation done at the end of the timeline. You'll see here I have cam1 underscore 1 through 144. That means that camera 1 is the camera that I rendered from, and that this is frame 1 to 144. And this comes in really handy when you have a bunch of different cameras with different frames rendered as different shots. So if we go down here, you can see I have cam 1, 144 to 192. So it looks like I have, for whatever reason, two different image sequences with different frame ranges here. Okay, and so 2 and 3 basically are the same frames as camera 1. Basically the entire main animation timeline from frame 1 to 144. And then I did some additional animation when I was done that I kind of decided to do after the fact. And then down here, cam 3, it looks a little bit different. You see here that frame 250 to 350 is the frame range, which doesn't really match up with these, and that I have this thing called X400. So just to talk about that really briefly, in Blender you can time remap, which means after you're done your animation, if it's going too fast or too slow, you can actually speed it up or slow it down. That changes the frames that your animation happens on. So if we go here to our scene settings, our output properties, underneath frame start, end, step, and frame rate, we have this thing called time remapping. And so basically, the easiest way to think of this is that for every 100 frames, we have 100 frames. If I was to do something like for every 100 frames, we have 400 frames, you could think of this as being slowed down 4 times or 400% slower. And so when I have that X400 in my folder name, really what I'm doing is just referring to this property here. And this is just a convention that I came up with so that I knew what that shot was. I know that this shot is actually a slowed down 400% slower shot. That just means that from these 100 frames that I have here are the same animation that exists within camera 3 here, but I've chosen to take a selection of it and slow it down, and that moves the frames that it's represented on from being somewhere within 1 to 144 to now being within the range of 250 to 350. So I will get into kind of what that means exactly when we take a look at our animation later on, but just be aware that naming your folders with your rendered images is going to be really beneficial when you start moving image sequences around, for instance, importing them into After Effects. If you don't do this, you will very quickly get confused and you won't be really sure what it is that you've rendered out. And just to show you what an image sequence looks like, you can see here that I've got some metadata burned into the image, and that's really easy to set up in Blender, but you can see here it actually burns in some timestamp information and also the frame number and the camera that's being used. So if I just press the down arrow, you can see here we're advancing frame. Okay, so now we're on frame 9, which corresponds to the number here. Okay, so I'll get into how to actually generate these a bit later. But for now, just make sure that you are having a really well planned project folder. For instance, all of your audio that you're using should go in an audio folder. Any blend files that you're making should go in this Blender folder. I'm actually going to drop this autosave file here in there. And then, keep a separate folder for each call it category of renders that you do. So my animatic renders here are actually going to have the same file names as my final renders. And these final renders are just higher quality renders that aren't necessarily animated any differently, but this is the same process you're going to go through when you fine tune and perfect your animations. This will allow you to essentially drop in and replace your final rendered images inside of your After Effects edits. Then I have a final folder here called videos, and this just has any exports I create from After Effects or any other video that is getting exported from the software. And you can see here I have those 2 videos I mentioned earlier, which is the animatic and then the final rendered version. Okay, so now let's take a look at our scene file and start animating.